Hi, my name is Dr. Sam Wilkie. I received my PhD from Berkeley, and in today's video I'm going to talk about 3 places where I don't trust science. All 3 areas where I don't trust science involve financial incentive. It turns out most science is very expensive. For example, your typical professor working at a university needs on the order of several $1,000,000 to maybe even tens of millions of dollars per year in order to do their research. And they generally have a team of both students and postdocs who are doing that research for them. So it's not just them doing the research alone, it's a group of people who they employ to do research for them. And it's very expensive, so they need lots of money. So the first area where I don't trust science is where the financial incentive is very obvious from a company or a government to support certain findings. A quick example is coffee. Is coffee good for you? Well, certainly you can show that coffee ramps up your athletic ability temporarily, or it increases your mental acuity for a brief period. So you can do research that supports that coffee is good for you. And there's a very large industry of coffee bean growers and coffee makers who want that research to show that coffee is good or beneficial to the human health. And so I don't trust that science. Not because that science is bad or erroneous, but if you're a researcher and you find, oh wait, even though coffee gives you this momentary uptick, it actually lowers your baseline. I'm not saying that's true, I'm just saying if you found that as a scientist, and that your mental acuity on the other side of it is after a few hours you had actually a mental fogginess that you wouldn't have had if you didn't drink coffee. If you do that research, you're probably just not going to publish it, because if you publish that, then suddenly this coffee industry that was giving you money to support your research, they're no longer giving you your money. And so now you as a scientist have to decide, do I just want to keep publishing the findings that keep my funding coming in, or do I want to look for new funding? And this is certainly a challenge that scientists face across the country all the time, across the globe, where they have to decide, okay, now I've found this other stuff that shows that maybe coffee's not so healthy, so I have this dilemma. Do I want to go out and find funding that I can continue to have with that's consistent with this finding, or do I want to just kind of keep this on the down low? Another great example, you've got industries like the chocolate and wine industries. So again, if you're a researcher, you get a lot of money from those industries to show that coffee and wine and chocolate are good for you. And so that's why when my Facebook feed pops up, oh, how drinking a glass of wine a day is healthy for you, I don't trust that science, because I'm not seeing the other side of it is, well, what are the deleterious effects of drinking a glass of wine a day? You know, who's doing that research? Where is that getting published? Who's funding that? Who's paying for that research? So that's one place I don't trust science. Let me give you an even bigger example. The tobacco industry and the sugar industry had a lot of money, and tobacco was trying to show that tobacco was good for you. Heck, doctors used to prescribe tobacco for nerves, and so it was thought to be healthy, and there was so much money from this tobacco industry to support that, hey, tobacco is actually good for you. And it took literally decades to overcome this bias. This bias was in place because you had so much money coming from the tobacco industry to science to show that tobacco is good for you. And it took decades to reverse this, to start getting money into scientists to show, oh, actually tobacco causes lung cancer, for example, or smoking tobacco leads to increased lung cancer. So that's very well documented at this point, but we had to get money to supporting scientists to say that. Similarly, the sugar industry for many years was villainizing fat. It was saying, hey, get rid of fat. I remember in the 1990s, you couldn't buy food with fat in it, it seemed. It was just the enemy. And that was the sugar industry trying to deflect blame away and getting people to consume more sugar, which we did. And it wasn't good for our health. And it's only now that we're starting to see how bad sugar can be for us, because we're starting to get money to scientists to support that. The final example I'll give is the absolute war on drugs in the 1980s from our federal government. If you were a researcher, one way to get a lot of money coming in was basically to show that drugs are bad for human health. And let's take marijuana as an example. You could quickly show that marijuana causes your short-term memory to decline for a lot of people. And that research is going to bring in more money from the federal government. But on the other side of losing your short-term memory, it turns out that people tend to have higher levels of creativity by certain measures. And so that research, it just wasn't being published anywhere because it would cause your funding to stop from the federal government. So we were just seeing half of the picture. We were just seeing, hey, marijuana is bad for you. But we weren't seeing, well, hey, it's bad in these ways, but it's actually possibly beneficial in these other ways. And I'm not condemning or condoning marijuana. I'm not interested in either way. I'm just saying I didn't trust the science in the 1980s because all the funding was to say that marijuana was bad. And similarly, I don't trust what's being published nowadays because now the industry is so wealthy. There is so much money in the legitimate marijuana business now that industry can support study after study that says, hey, marijuana actually increases your creativity. So I don't trust that either because in both scenarios, you have scientists who already are trying to make experiments with certain outcomes. So right now, if you're a scientist and your cash cow is the marijuana industry, you're going to design your experiments and you're ideally going to get results that show marijuana is good. And you're going to exclusively publish those results that marijuana is good or maybe not, like maybe it's neutral, but you're probably going to just not publish stuff that says marijuana is not so good for your health. So that's one place I don't trust science, is where companies are going to make money off of certain results because you know that scientists are going to find a way to design studies that support that narrative that, oh, this thing is good for your health. And they're going to kind of bury their science that shows that it's not so good. Or they're going to have to find new funding sources. And certainly that's a challenge that scientists face day in and day out. The second place I don't trust science is not just financial incentive, but prestige. It's all about being first. In science, it's so much more prestige to be the first to discover something. To follow in someone's footsteps and verify the results, there's just not a lot of money in that. There's not a lot of prestige in that. It's very important, and unfortunately, there's not enough incentive. And it's something the scientific community is aware of and trying to address, is get away from this model of who's the first, but also, hey, it's first, but lots of people are willing to verify. So one thing about this prestige is also, let's say you're doing research and a lot of your results are inconclusive. What you might do, and this is very common, is in your data set, you'll have often outliers. And depending on the science you're doing, often you can decide, hey, these are outliers, they're not real data that we should be concerned with, and so we're going to get rid of these outliers. And you document this in your paper. You tend to show the outliers and explain why you got rid of them. But sometimes the results with the outliers included in the data, you don't have anything conclusive. But when you remove certain outliers, then maybe you have a trend. And so you can say something more profound. And so because of this constant drive to be first, you have some scientists who they have this bias to get a result. And in that attempt to get a result, because they need the money to keep coming in, they need to get published in journals. So maybe they do things like remove certain data points intentionally, and they're clear about it, in order to create a result that supports something that's more profound than, hey, we did this study and we can't conclude anything. Instead, they're like, oh, we did this study and here's this trend we can show you. So again, science, there's so much pressure to publish in prestigious journals that sometimes scientists will bias their results, or they'll bias how they look at their data to get results that support something more profound. The third way I don't trust science isn't really the science so much as how the science is presented to you through some media outlet. Media has massive financial incentive to get you to read their articles and to forward their articles to other people to read. So in the old days, it was magazines and newspapers, and not only would you make money off the magazines you sold and the newspapers you sold, but the more you sold, the more advertisers would be willing to pay you to publish ads in your newspaper or magazine. Nowadays, Heck, they can even see if you're scrolling down reading an article. So now if I'm publishing content, I want you to read the article, and I can tell you if you've read it because I can see if you scroll down. And then I know how many people read it because you forward it, and we track all that information. And my incentive as a media person is not to show you the right science, but it's to get you to read and to forward. And so I might embellish a little bit. It's kind of like storytelling. It's telling exactly how it happened maybe isn't the best story, but maybe there's an embellishment, or maybe focus on things that people might be attracted to. So for instance, let's say you're quoting some science on climate change. And in that article, the scientists said, hey, here's what we think based on our modeling is going to happen in the next 50 to 100 years. The globe is going to heat up by 1 or 2 degrees roughly. And then that scientist also says, hey, here's a best case scenario and here's a worst case scenario. Well, guess what the media is going to use as their headline? They're going to look at the worst case scenario. So that's not what the scientist is trying to communicate. They're just doing their due diligence to say, hey, here's what we think is going to happen to the client. Best case scenario, worst case scenario. But the media outlet, they want you to read the headline and forward the headline. So they give you that doomsday scenario right up front. And they might even sell it to you as, hey, this is what scientists think is going to happen, which is generally not the case. So if you're reading from media about science, really take it with a huge grain of salt, especially if you're reading media that is already biased politically to the left or to the right, or if you're reading media that you know is non-factual, like The Inquirer or Breitbart or Occupy Democrats. These are basically propaganda machines for the left and the right, and National Enquirer is largely for entertainment. So you have these media sources that aren't looking to give you facts. They're just trying to get your eyeballs so they can sell advertising space to advertisers. So those are the 3 places that I don't trust science. One is a company making money because these results support that company in some way. 2, is this the first instance of a scientist saying something, or is it the 100th scientist saying it? If it's the first, it's a grain of salt. If there's 100 scientists saying, hey, smoking tobacco is likely to lead to a higher risk for cancer for you, and there's 100 scientists who've all concluded that same thing, I tend to trust that more. And then the 3rd place is, where are you getting your information from? If you read the scientific paper itself, you're going to find that it typically takes a few weeks to be able to understand even a single scientific paper. They use so much jargon. They're not doing that to confuse anyone. They're just doing that because science is so complex that generally when you get drilled down into a specific field, then you have introduced all this jargon to talk to other members of the field in a more concise way. So if you and I just randomly read a paper on climate change, we're probably going to be introduced to a bunch of terms we've never known before. Or if we read a scientific paper on particle physics, you bet your bottom there's going to be a very dense paper that's going to take weeks or maybe even months to understand that single scientific paper. Versus if you read it through a media, you're getting a watered down kind of coffee table science version of it that may not really reflect the science as well. So just know that when you read the media coverage of science, you're getting a watered down version. Hit that like button if you enjoyed today's video. Comments are always helpful because then I can understand what are people getting out of my videos and what can I do next. And hit the subscribe button if you want to know when my next video comes out. Thank you very much for your time.